The transport truck lurched to a stop, and Kim Soo-jin braced herself against the wooden slat that had become her anchor during 3 days of travel. Through the gaps in the canvas covering, she caught glimpses of a world that seemed impossibly clean. White buildings that gleamed in the afternoon sun, streets free of bomb craters, people walking without the hunched shoulders of perpetual fear. The other women pressed close, their breathing shallow and quick. After years of learning to make themselves small, invisible, silent, none of them knew how to exist in open spaces anymore. "Out! Everyone out!" The American soldier's voice carried none of the cruelty they'd learned to expect from men in uniform, but Soo-jin's body tensed anyway. Beside her, Hana's fingers found hers in the dimness, their shared trembling a language older than words. They descended from the truck into the blinding California sunshine. 17 women ranging from barely 20 to nearly 40, though trauma had aged them all beyond their years. The youngest, Mei Lin from Taiwan, kept her eyes fixed on the ground, her shoulders drawn so far forward she seemed to be collapsing inward. The oldest, Keiko from a fishing village in Korea, held her chin level, but her jaw was locked so tight Soo-jin could see the muscles jumping beneath her weathered skin. The building before them made no sense. It wasn't a barracks or a prison. Large windows revealed glimpses of chrome and mirrors, and through the open door came the scent of something floral and chemical, permanent wave solution, though none of them would have recognized it then. A sign above the entrance read, "Stella's Beauty Salon," in cursive letters that looked like they'd been painted by someone who believed in beautiful things. Lieutenant Morrison, the young officer who'd been assigned as their liaison, cleared his throat. He was perhaps 25, with sandy hair and freckles that made him look even younger, and the way he wouldn't quite meet their eyes told Soo-jin he knew at least some of what they'd endured. "Ladies," he began, then paused, seeming to reconsider his word choice. "You've been through hell. The psychological evaluation team believes that helping you feel human again starts with small dignities. This is a beauty salon. The women inside are volunteers. They're going to help you with your hair, your nails." He gestured vaguely, his discomfort palpable. "It's a gift, a welcome to America." The 17 women stood in perfect stillness, a habit ingrained by survival. Speaking out of turn had meant beatings. Moving without permission had meant worse. Even now, even here, even with the war 3 months in the past and the Pacific Ocean between them and their torment, they waited for the other shoe to drop. There was always another shoe. A woman emerged from the salon, middle-aged and plump, with bright red hair piled high on her head and lipstick the color of cherries. Her dress was loud with flowers, her smile enormous and genuine. "Oh, honey," she said, addressing them collectively, her voice cracking with emotion. "Oh, you poor babies. Come on in. We're going to take such good care of you." Soo-jin's felt Hana's grip tighten to the point of pain. Around them, the other women remained frozen. The gap between the truck and that doorway might as well have been the Grand Canyon. On one side was everything they knew. Suffering, yes, but at least familiar. On the other was something none of them possessed the framework to understand: unconditional kindness from strangers. It was Keiko who moved first. She'd been a teacher before the Japanese military police had come to her village, before they dragged her from her classroom and loaded her onto a truck with 11 other women, before her life had become a series of rooms she couldn't escape and men she couldn't refuse. That earlier self, the woman who'd taught children to read, who'd believed in the power of education and dignity, stirred somewhere deep inside her. She took one step forward, then another, and the others followed because that's what they'd learned to do: follow, obey, survive. The interior of Stella's beauty salon was a revelation. Chrome chairs upholstered in pink vinyl, mirrors that reflected light in every direction, photographs of women with elaborate hairstyles adorning the walls. The scent was overwhelming, perfume and hairspray and nail polish and something baking in a back room. A dozen women in colorful dresses waited, their faces carefully composed to hide their shock at the sight of these 17 ghosts who shuffled through the door. Stella herself stepped forward, and Sujin found herself looking into eyes that held both pity and determination. "My name is Stella Romano," the woman said, slowly, clearly, though she had to know none of them spoke English. "Today, you are my guests. Today, we make you beautiful." The women scattered to individual stations like startled birds, each guided by a different stylist. Sujin found herself in a chair that tilted backward, staring up at a ceiling dotted with water stains that formed patterns she tried to read like tea leaves. The woman assigned to her was younger than Stella, perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled into a neat bun and capable hands that moved with practiced efficiency. "I'm Dorothy," the woman said, draping a cape around Sujin's shoulders. "Don't worry, I'm just going to wash your hair first, okay?" The words meant nothing, but the gesture toward the sink was clear enough. Sujin allowed herself to be positioned, her neck resting in the curved porcelain, and then Dorothy turned on the water. The temperature was perfect, warm but not hot, the pressure gentle against her scalp. Dorothy's fingers worked shampoo into her hair, and the sensation was so foreign, so unexpectedly tender, that Sujin felt something crack inside her chest. When had anyone last touched her with kindness? When had anyone's hands on her body meant anything other than violation? The tears came without permission, sliding down her temples into her hairline, mixing with the soap and water. Dorothy made a soft sound of sympathy and continued washing, her fingers massaging Sujin's scalp in slow circles that seemed designed to unknot not just tangles, but trauma itself. Across the salon, similar scenes were unfolding. Hannah sat rigid as a board, while a stylist named Betty attempted to comb through hair that hadn't been properly washed in months. The young woman worked with infinite patience, starting at the ends and working up, never pulling hard enough to hurt, murmuring soft reassurances in a language Hannah couldn't understand, but whose tone transcended words. Mei Lin, the youngest at 19, had begun to shake uncontrollably when her stylist approached with scissors. The woman, whose name tag read Patricia, immediately set them down, and instead offered her a hand mirror. Mei Lin stared at her reflection as if at a stranger. The face looking back was gaunt, the eyes too large and too haunted, the skin marked with scars that told stories no one should have to tell. Patricia gently took the mirror back and instead offered a piece of hard candy from her pocket. Mei Lin accepted it with trembling fingers, the simple sweetness on her tongue, the first taste of sugar she'd had in 3 years. Lieutenant Morrison had retreated to a corner with a cup of coffee someone had pressed into his hands. He watched the proceedings with an expression that cycled between relief and guilt. He'd been the one to suggest this outing to his commanding officer, arguing that the women needed more than just medical care and debriefing. They needed to remember what it felt like to be human, to be women, to be something other than victims. Captain Henderson had been skeptical. "They're refugees, Morrison, not socialites. We need intelligence from them, not makeovers." But Morrison had persisted, citing the psychological reports that described women so broken they could barely speak, who flinched at every sound, who had to be coaxed to eat. "They've given us plenty of intelligence, sir. They've told us everything they can about the comfort station system, about troop movements, about supply lines. Now they need something back. They need to know they're safe. They need to know they're valued as human beings, not just intelligence assets." Henderson had relented, and Morrison had reached out through his network of contacts until he found Stella Romano, a woman whose brother had died at Guadalcanal and who carried both grief and a fierce determination to honor his sacrifice by helping those who'd suffered under Japanese occupation. Now, watching Stella move from station to station, touching shoulders and offering encouragement in words these women couldn't understand but whose warmth they could feel, Morrison wondered if he'd underestimated what a difference this might make. Keiko found herself before a wall of nail polish bottles, a rainbow of colors in tiny glass vials that caught the light like jewels. The stylist assigned to her, an older woman named Ruth, with silver hair and gentle eyes, gestured to the collection with an inviting smile. She said, "Pick one," miming the action, "any color you want." The concept of choice was almost too much. For years, Keiko's choices had been reduced to a binary of submission or death, and even submission hadn't always guaranteed survival. Now she was being offered dozens of options for something as frivolous as nail color, and she had no framework for making such a decision.
Ruth seemed to understand. She selected a soft pink bottle and held it up questioningly. Keiko nodded. The path of least resistance, the safest choice. But as Ruth began to work on her hands, filing nails that had been torn and neglected, painting them with careful strokes of color, Keiko felt something stir that she'd thought long dead. It was such a small thing. Nail polish. Such a trivial luxury. But as she watched her hands transform from the broken tools of survival into something almost pretty, almost feminine, almost normal, she felt the first fragile tendril of hope unfurling her chest. The salon's radio played softly in the background, big band music that spoke of a world these women had been forcibly removed from. Glenn Miller's orchestra swung through In the Mood, and one of the stylists, a young black woman named Claudia, hummed along as she worked on the hair of a woman named Jung-hee. Claudia had her own story of discrimination and hardship in America, had her own reasons for volunteering to help these refugees, and as she shaped Jung-hee's hair into soft waves, she found herself thinking about the different forms oppression could take and the various paths to reclaiming dignity. Soojin's hair was being cut now, and she watched in the mirror as Dorothy carefully trimmed away the damaged ends, shaped what remained into something resembling a style. The woman she saw emerging was younger than she felt, and prettier than she remembered. The last time she'd looked in a mirror with any real attention, she'd been 22, engaged to be married to a teacher from the next village. That was before the war had swallowed her whole. "You're beautiful," Dorothy said, catching her eye in the mirror. The words were incomprehensible, but the meaning was clear in her expression. Soojin wanted to argue, wanted to explain that beauty was a curse that had led to her selection for the comfort stations, that being pretty had been the worst thing that could happen to a young woman when the Japanese military came recruiting. But instead, she found herself studying her reflection, looking for traces of the girl she'd been before the world had shown her its worst face. Across the salon, Hannah was experiencing her own transformation. Betty had managed to work through the tangles and was now setting her hair in rollers, the process mechanical and soothing in its predictability. Hannah had beautiful hair when it was clean, thick and black with a natural wave that had once been the envy of her sisters. She thought of those sisters now, wondered if they'd survived the war, if they'd escaped the fate that had befallen her when she'd been caught trying to evacuate Seoul ahead of the advancing Japanese forces. The youngest of her sisters, Minji, had been only 12 when Hannah had last seen her. She'd be 17 now, nearly grown. Did she remember her oldest sister? Did she know what had happened to her? The questions were knives that Hannah had learned to carry carefully, pulling them out only when she could bear the cutting. Lieutenant Morrison's coffee had gone cold in his hands. He set it aside and approached Stella, who was supervising the application of makeup to one of the women, a delicate process given how much the poor thing was trembling. "How are they doing?" he asked quietly. Stella glanced at him, her professional smile softening into something more genuine. "Better than I expected, honestly. I've seen shell shock before. My cousin came back from Anzio and couldn't stand to be in crowded rooms for months. But these women—" She paused, searching for words. "They're not just shell-shocked, Lieutenant. They're soul-shocked. What they've been through goes beyond combat trauma." Morrison nodded, grateful that she understood without him having to explain. The reports from the comfort stations were classified at the highest levels, the details so horrific that even battle-hardened officers had struggled to read them without becoming physically ill. Systematic rape as a military policy. Women forced to service dozens of soldiers per day. Brutality that served no strategic purpose except to dehumanize and destroy. The Japanese government would deny it all, of course, but Morrison had seen the evidence, had taken statements from the survivors. He knew the truth, and it haunted his sleep. "What you're doing here," he said to Stella, "it matters. Thank you." She patted his arm with maternal affection, though she was probably only a decade older than him. "All we can do is try to put some pieces back together. War breaks things. People, countries, trust. All we can do is try to put some pieces back together." The transformations were beginning to show results. Women who'd shuffled into the salon with their heads down and their spirits broken were sitting straighter, touching their newly styled hair with tentative wonder, examining manicured nails as if they were precious artifacts. The change wasn't just cosmetic, though the cosmetic changes were dramatic. It was something deeper, something that showed in the way shoulders relaxed incrementally, the way breath came a little easier, the way some of them were beginning to make eye contact with their stylists and even attempt shy smiles. Mei Lin was the exception. The youngest of the group remained hunched in her chair, barely responsive even as her stylist worked gentle magic on her appearance. Patricia had given up trying to engage her in the traditional sense and instead worked in quiet companionship, letting her presence be a comfort rather than a demand. She'd seen this before in her volunteer work at the Veterans Hospital. People so traumatized that human connection felt like another threat rather than a lifeline. All you can do is be patient, be present, and wait for them to come back from wherever they'd retreated to inside themselves.
The radio transitioned to Bing Crosby crooning, "I'll be seeing you," and several of the stylists hummed along as they worked. The song spoke of absence and longing, of peoples separated by war, and in her chair, Soo-jin felt the lyrics even without understanding the English words. The melody itself was sad enough to carry the meaning, someone singing about remembering a loved one, about maintaining connection across impossible distances. She thought of her mother, who would be in her 60s now if she'd survived the war. Her father had died when Soo-jin was young, and her mother had raised her and her 3 brothers alone, working as a seamstress to keep them fed. When the Japanese occupation had tightened its grip, when the military police had come for young women to fill their comfort stations, her mother had hidden her in a root cellar for 3 days. But they'd come back with dogs, and the dogs had found her. And the last thing Soo-jin had seen as they dragged her away was her mother's face contorted with grief and rage and helplessness. Did her mother think she was dead? It might be better if she did. How could Soo-jin ever return home carrying the shame of what had been done to her? In Korean culture, a woman's purity was everything. What was she now but a vessel of dishonor, a living reminder of the worst things humanity could do? Dorothy must have sensed her distress, because she squeezed Soo-jin's shoulder gently and offered her a tissue. Soo-jin accepted it gratefully, dabbing at eyes that threatened to overflow again. The kindness kept undoing her, kept finding cracks in the armor she'd built to survive. Keiko's nails were dry now, 10 perfect ovals of soft pink that looked absurdly delicate against her work-roughened hands. Ruth had moved on to her hair, brushing it out with long, soothing strokes that reminded Keiko of her own mother brushing her hair as a child. She'd had a daughter once, briefly. The baby had been born in the comfort station, the result of countless violations that made paternity impossible to determine. Keiko had held her for 3 hours before the camp guards had taken her away. She didn't know what had happened to that child, didn't know if she'd survived, didn't even know if hoping she had survived was the right thing to wish for. What kind of life could a mixed-race child born of rape expect in post-war Asia? These thoughts were dangerous, were the kind that could pull you under if you let them. So Keiko focused instead on the sensation of the brush moving through her hair, on the gentle hands that were treating her like something precious rather than something disposable. She focused on this moment, this breath,
This unexpected mercy of strangers who owed her nothing but were giving her everything. 2 hours had passed, though it felt both longer and shorter to everyone involved. The women who now occupied the salon chairs bore little resemblance to the ones who'd shuffled in that afternoon. Hair had been washed, cut, and styled. Nails had been filed and polished. Some of the braver ones had even allowed light makeup, a touch of powder, a hint of lipstick. The physical transformations were remarkable, but the emotional ones were even more profound. Hannah caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and actually gasped. The woman looking back at her was familiar but strange, like seeing a photograph of yourself from years ago and being surprised by how young you looked. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, her nails gleamed with a conservative red polish, and someone had applied just enough makeup to bring color back to her cheeks without making her look garish. She looked normal. She looked like someone who might have a life, who might have a future, who might be something more than a collection of scars and sorrows. Betty said, beaming at her in the mirror, "Pretty, so pretty." Hannah understood that word. She'd learned it from the soldiers who'd used it even as they'd hurt her, had learned to hate it as a curse that had brought nothing but pain. But hearing it now, spoken with genuine admiration by a woman who expected nothing from her except to accept a compliment, the word shifted meaning. Pretty could be neutral. Pretty could just be an observation, a statement of fact without the weight of threat behind it. She tried out a smile, the muscles in her face moving stiffly from disuse.
Su-jin found her bunk and carefully arranged her bag of cosmetics on the small shelf beside it. She picked up the note and, though she'd already read it multiple times, read it again. "You are beautiful. You are valuable. You are loved." The words seemed impossible, seemed like they must be intended for someone else, someone who hadn't been through what she'd been through, someone who hadn't been reduced to a number and a function and a receptacle for men's violence. But as she looked around the dormitory at the other women, at Hannah carefully wrapping her hair in the scarf Mrs. Chen had provided to protect the style while she slept, at Keiko sitting with her hands folded in her lap so the polish wouldn't smudge, at even Mei Lin touching her own face with something like wonder, Su-jin allowed herself to consider the possibility that the note might be true. Not because of anything she'd done or failed to do, not because of what had happened to her or what she'd survived, but simply because she was human, because she existed, because somehow, despite everything, she was still here.
Lieutenant Morrison has arranged another outing for next week, Mrs. Chen announced to the group. This time, you'll be going to a park for a picnic. There will be other women there, American women who want to meet you, to welcome you to this country. You don't have to go if you don't want to, but I think it might be good for you. I think it might help. The response was mixed. Some of the women looked intrigued, while others appeared terrified at the prospect of more social interaction. Su-jin found herself somewhere in the middle, drawn to the possibility of connection, but wary of the vulnerability it required. Still, after yesterday's experience at the salon, she was beginning to consider that maybe, just maybe, not all new experiences would end in pain. The week between the salon visit and the picnic passed in a strange suspension of time. The women were caught between worlds, no longer in captivity but not yet free, no longer in immediate danger but not yet safe, no longer defined solely by their trauma but not yet sure what else they might be. The temporary housing facility became a liminal space where 17 futures hung in uncertain balance. Lieutenant Morrison visited twice during that week, ostensibly to check on logistics, but really to gauge how the women were adjusting. He'd become invested in their recovery in a way that went beyond his official duties, and he knew it. His sister had been a missionary in China before the war, and she'd written to him about the comfort women, about the systematic brutality, about the need for justice that would likely never come.
When she died in a Japanese prison camp in 1943, Morrison had made a silent vow to honor her memory by helping any survivors he encountered. These 17 women were that opportunity, and he was determined not to waste it. On his Tuesday visit, he brought newspapers, both English and Korean editions, and magazines that showed American life in glossy photographs. Mrs. Chen helped translate the articles about post-war reconstruction, about women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, about the changing social landscape that the war had created. The women pored over the images like archaeologists studying artifacts from an alien civilization. Women in pants working in factories, women voting in local elections, women laughing together in diners and shops, their faces free of the pinched weariness that came from living under occupation. "Is this real?" Keiko asked through Mrs. Chen, pointing to a photograph of women in a labor union meeting. "Women can do this? Can organize? Can demand things?" "In America, yes," Mrs. Chen confirmed. "American women have been fighting for their rights for a long time. They got the vote in 1920, and the war has opened even more doors. It's not perfect, there's still discrimination, still obstacles, but compared to what you knew in Korea or under Japanese occupation, it's very different." The concept was almost too large to grasp. Back home, women were expected to be obedient daughters, then obedient wives, then obedient mothers. Their value was measured in their service to men and their ability to produce male heirs. Education for women had been limited, opportunities for independence nearly non-existent. And then the occupation had made everything worse, had reduced women to even less than they'd been before, had made them property in the most brutal and literal sense. But these photographs suggested a different possibility. These images showed women with agency, with voices, with power over their own lives. Could such a thing really exist? And if it could, might there be a place in it for women like them? Women who'd been broken and discarded, who carried shame like a second skin, who'd lost everything that had once defined them. Hannah found herself drawn to a particular image. A woman about her age standing in front of a small shop, a sign above her head reading, "Marie's Dress Shop." The woman in the photograph wore a proud expression, her hands on her hips, clearly the owner of this establishment. Could we do this? Could we have businesses? Could we support ourselves? Mrs. Chen heard her and smiled. Of course. In fact, the government program that's processing your asylum includes vocational training. You'll be taught skills that will help you find work here: sewing, typing, cooking in restaurants, factory work, whatever interests you, and whatever you're capable of learning. The goal is to help you become self-sufficient, to build new lives here.
The word new hung in the air like a promise and a threat. New meant letting go of old, meant acknowledging that the lives they'd imagined for themselves in Korea were gone forever. Even if they returned home, and many still dreamed of that possibility despite the impossibility of it, they would be returning as different people to a different country. The Korea they'd left no longer existed. The Japanese occupation had ended, replaced by a complex political situation involving Soviet influence in the north and American influence in the south. Their home villages might be in territories they could never access. Their families might be scattered or dead. Going back might be even more impossible than moving forward. Su Jin studied a photograph of a woman standing in front of a classroom, pointing to a chalkboard filled with English words. "I was going to be a teacher," she said quietly. I just finished my training when—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to speak the words that would make the horror real again. Mrs. Chen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You could still be a teacher. It would take time. You'd need to improve your English, get the proper certifications, but it's possible. Everything is possible now. That's what freedom means." That night, the dormitory buzzed with whispered conversations that lasted well past lights out. The women discussed the photographs they'd seen, the possibilities they represented, the dreams they might dare to dream again. It was tentative, this hope, fragile as spun glass, but it was there, growing in the spaces that trauma had previously filled completely. Mei Lin lay in her bunk and listened to the others talk. She hadn't contributed to the discussion, hadn't shared any dreams or aspirations, because the truth was that she couldn't imagine a future at all. At 19, she'd already lived through more horror than most people faced in a lifetime. She'd been pulled from her village in Taiwan at 16, had spent 3 years being violated by an average of 20 soldiers per day, had been beaten so many times she'd lost count, had contracted diseases that left her sterile and in chronic pain. But as she lay there in the darkness, listening to Hana describe her dream of owning a small restaurant, listening to Keiko talk about maybe teaching again someday, listening to even the quiet ones beginning to voice tiny hopes, something shifted in Mei Lin's chest. It wasn't hope, exactly. Hope felt too big, too dangerous, but it was something. A crack in the certainty of her own worthlessness, a question mark where before there had been only a period. What if the other women were right? What if there was more to life than what had been done to them? The day of the picnic arrived with perfect California weather, sunshine that felt warm without being oppressive, a breeze that carried the scent of eucalyptus and ocean salt. Lieutenant Morrison arrived early, with 2 trucks this time, both decorated with small American flags that snapped cheerfully in the wind. He'd brought a surprise: 17 dresses in various sizes, donated by a local women's church group. "I know you have the clothes you've been wearing," he said through Mrs. Chen's translation, "but I thought you might like something new for today, something pretty. You don't have to wear them if you don't want to, but they're yours if you do." The dresses were laid out in the common room, florals and solids, modest styles with tea-length skirts and short sleeves, in colors that ranged from soft pastels to bold jewel tones. The women approached them cautiously, as if the garments might bite. But once Keiko reached out and touched the fabric of a blue dress, the others followed. The material was soft, clean, clearly made with care. These weren't cast-offs or charity bin rejects. These were nice dresses, the kind you'd wear to church or a social event, the kind that said you mattered. Su Jin selected a pale yellow dress with small white flowers embroidered around the collar. She hadn't worn anything this feminine since before her capture, had become so accustomed to rough, shapeless clothing that the feel of the dress against her skin was almost shocking. She changed in the communal bathroom and caught herself in the mirror. Yellow dress, styled hair that still held some of its shape from the salon visit, the hint of lipstick that she'd applied that morning. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable. Hana chose green, a color that brought out the warmth in her skin tone and made her dark eyes seem even more expressive. Jong-hee selected red, bold and defiant, while most of the others gravitated towards safer choices, blues and soft pinks and modest prints. Even Mei Lin, who'd initially refused to even look at the dresses, eventually allowed Mrs. Chen to help her into a lavender one that made her look even younger than her 19 years. The trucks rumbled through the streets of Los Angeles, and this time the women looked out at the passing scenery with more curiosity and less fear. They saw mothers pushing baby carriages, businessmen hurrying to appointments, teenagers gathered outside a soda shop, dogs being walked on leashes. Ordinary life. Normal life. The kind of life that once had been theirs and might, impossibly, be theirs again. The park was a revelation. Green grass stretched in every direction, dotted with large oak trees that provided islands of shade. Picnic tables had been set up in a grove, already laden with food that made the women's eyes widen. Fried chicken, potato salad, coleslaw, fresh bread, fruit salad, and lemonade in large glass pitchers. And surrounding the tables were perhaps 30 American women of various ages, all wearing their Sunday best, all waiting with expressions that ranged from eager to nervous. Stella Romano was there, of course, along with several of the stylists from the Salon. But there were others, too. Members of the Women's Auxiliary, church volunteers, wives of servicemen, working women who'd taken the day off. They'd come because Lieutenant Morrison had put out a call through various organizations explaining that these refugee women needed community, needed connection, needed to see that America could be a welcoming home. "Welcome," Stella called out as the women descended from the trucks. "We're so glad you could join us today. Please, come, eat, relax, enjoy yourselves. This is your day."
Mrs. Chen translated, and the 17 women moved toward the picnic area with varying degrees of hesitation. The American women had been briefed not to ask questions about their experiences, not to pry into their trauma, but simply to treat them as guests, as new friends, as women deserving of a pleasant afternoon in the park. Dorothy from the Salon approached Sujin with a warm smile and gestured to the food. "Hungry?" she asked, miming eating. Sujin nodded, and Dorothy handed her a plate, then walked with her along the buffet, pointing out different dishes and encouraging her to try everything. The fried chicken was revelatory, crispy and seasoned in ways she'd never experienced. The potato salad was creamy and tangy. The lemonade was sweet and cold and perfect. They sat together at a picnic table, and Dorothy pulled out a small photo album. She pointed to a picture of herself with a man in military uniform. "My husband," she said. "Tom. He's in Germany right now. Army engineer." She touched the photo tenderly, and Sujin understood that this woman also knew about separation, about loving someone you couldn't be with, about the particular loneliness war created. Sujin pulled out the small photograph that had been taken at the salon, the group shot of all 17 women. She pointed to herself, then to Hana, then to Kieko, naming each woman in turn. Dorothy listened carefully, repeating the names, trying to get the pronunciation right. It was such a simple thing, this exchange of names and faces, but it felt profound. They were seeing each other, really seeing each other, across the vast divide of language and culture and experience. Across the grove, Hana found herself in conversation, if it could be called that, with a group of women her age. They communicated through gestures and expressions and the occasional word that Mrs. Chen translated as she circulated among the groups. One woman, whose name tag identified her as Susan, showed Hana pictures of her children, 2 boys with gap-toothed grins. Another, named Margaret, demonstrated a card trick that made everyone laugh. A third, Janet, shared cookies she'd baked that morning, shaped like stars and frosted in red, white, and blue. The simple normalcy of it was overwhelming. These women weren't asking Hana about her suffering, or treating her like a victim, or even acknowledging the gulf between their experiences. They were just being friendly, sharing their lives, inviting her into their circle as if she belonged there. Kieko sat under an oak tree with Ruth from the salon and 2 other older women, and they taught her a hand-clapping game that involved complex rhythms and patterns. Kieko's hands, still adorned with their pink nail polish, moved through the sequences, and when she made a mistake, the women laughed, not at her, but with her, gentle and encouraging. One of them, a grandmother type named Ethel, produced a harmonica and played folk tunes while they all clapped along. For the first time in 3 years, Kieko laughed. Not a bitter laugh or a hollow laugh, but a real laugh, the kind that came from genuine joy, from being in the moment, from remembering what it felt like to simply play. The sound startled her own ears, and tears sprang to her eyes, even as she continued laughing, the emotions so tangled and complex she couldn't separate them. Lieutenant Morrison watched from a distance, letting the women have their space, but staying alert for any signs of distress. What he saw instead was miraculous in its simplicity. Women connecting with women. Barriers falling, tiny seeds of trust being planted in soil that had been scorched by trauma. It wouldn't fix everything. He knew that. These women would carry their scars forever, would have nightmares and triggers, and days when the weight of what they'd endured would feel crushing. But these moments of normalcy, of kindness, of human connection, this was fertilizer for hope. This was how healing began. The afternoon wore on, and the initial stiffness gradually melted away. Some of the bolder American women initiated simple games, a beanbag toss, a relay race that had everyone cheering and laughing at the comedic attempts to run in nice dresses. Mei Lin, who'd been sitting alone under a tree for most of the picnic, found herself approached by a young woman not much older than herself.
"Hi," the woman said, settling down beside her without asking permission. "I'm Annie." She had bright red hair and freckles and an open, friendly face that seemed incapable of guile. Through a combination of gestures and the few Korean words she'd clearly learned just for this occasion, Annie communicated that she worked at a local library, that she loved books, that she wondered if Mei Lin liked to read. Mei Lin hadn't held a book in 3 years. Reading had been a pleasure of her former life, when she'd been a student who dreamed of becoming a writer. But at Annie's question, something in her flickered to life. She nodded, just slightly, and Annie's face lit up. She produced a book from her bag, a simple children's story with pictures, designed for English learners. She opened it and began to read, her finger following the words, speaking slowly and clearly. Mei Lin found herself leaning in, watching the words, remembering what it felt like to lose herself in a story, to inhabit a world that existed only in imagination. Annie's voice was soothing, the story simple but sweet, something about a rabbit who made friends with a bird. When she finished, she offered the book to Mei Lin. "For you," she said, "to keep." Mei Lin accepted the book with trembling hands and pressed it to her chest like a talisman. It was the first gift anyone had given her in years that came with no strings attached, no expectations, no ulterior motives. Just a book, just kindness, just the simple acknowledgement that she might want to read, might want to learn, might want to imagine herself into stories where happy endings were possible. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in watercolors, Stella gathered everyone together for one final activity. She'd brought a camera with color film, a luxury in those days, and she wanted to take a photograph of everyone together, Americans and Koreans, all mixed in. The women arranged themselves in a loose grouping, Americans and refugees intermingled, arms around each other's shoulders, faces turned toward the camera. When the shutter clicked, it captured more than just an image. It captured a moment of possibility, of connection across enormous divides, of hope asserting itself against overwhelming odds. "Before we leave," Stella announced through Mrs. Chen's translation, "I want to tell you all something. This isn't goodbye. We want to stay connected with you. We want to help you build lives here, to find jobs, to make friends, to become part of this community. You're not alone anymore. You have sisters here now." Several of the American women were crying openly, moved by the afternoon's experiences, by the privilege of witnessing these women's first steps toward healing. Several of the Korean women were crying too, overwhelmed by the generosity, by the acceptance, by the radical notion that they might actually be welcome here. On the truck ride back, the atmosphere was transformed from that first journey to the Salon. Women who'd been strangers were now sitting close together, some holding hands, some leaning against each other in comfortable silence. They'd crossed some invisible threshold that afternoon, had moved from victims to survivors, to women with futures. Sujen sat with her photo album of the day. Dorothy had given it to her, filled with pictures from the picnic, and studied the images. There she was, laughing with a group of women. There was Hana, teaching Susan a Korean hand game. There was Keiko, her head thrown back in mid-laugh. There was even Mei Lin,
clutching her book, the faintest hint of a smile on her face. These weren't photographs of broken women. These were photographs of women who were healing, who were fighting their way back to themselves, who were daring to believe that their stories might not end in the horror that had defined their recent past. The temporary housing facility had become less temporary and more home. The women had settled into routines, English classes every morning, vocational training in the afternoons, therapy sessions twice a week with a psychologist who specialized in trauma. The nightmares hadn't stopped, and probably never would completely, but they came less frequently. The panic attacks were more manageable. The overwhelming shame was beginning, slowly, to lift. Sujin had discovered an aptitude for typing and was working toward certification that would allow her to work in an office. She attended English class with fierce dedication, determined to master this language that would unlock opportunities in her new country. In the evenings, she wrote letters to Dorothy, painstakingly composed in halting English, describing her progress and her gratitude. Hana had enrolled in a cooking course and was learning American cuisine alongside the Korean cooking she already knew. She dreamed of opening a restaurant someday, a place that served both cultures' foods, a bridge between her old world and her new one. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything about her current life had once seemed impossible.
Keiko had begun volunteering at a local elementary school, helping in the library, reading to children who were learning English. Being around kids again awakened something in her that she thought was dead, her teacher's heart, her love of watching young minds discover new ideas. She thought about her daughter less painfully now, able to hold both the grief of that loss and the hope that wherever she was safe and loved. Even Mei Lin had found something approaching peace. She spent hours in the library where Annie worked, slowly working her way through books in English, rebuilding the vocabulary of her inner life. She'd started writing again, too. Small things at first, just descriptions of her day, but gradually working toward the stories she used to dream of telling. Annie had become her closest friend, and in that friendship, Mei Lin had found a safe space to begin reconstructing her sense of self. The 17 women weren't healed. Healing from trauma that severe was a lifetime's work, not a few months' achievement. But they were healing, actively engaged in the process, supported by a community that had embraced them, by a government program that was actually helping them, by each other. Lieutenant Morrison's sister would have been proud, he thought as he watched them in their English class one morning. These women were more than survivors. They were becoming thrivers, taking the worst that humanity had offered and refusing to let it define them permanently. The comfort stations had been designed to break them, to reduce them to nothing but receptacles for violence and shame. But they had survived, and in surviving, they had proven something essential about the human spirit, that it could be bent and crushed and seemingly destroyed, but that it could also, given the right conditions, regenerate. Like trees that sprouted new growth after a forest fire, they were rebuilding themselves from the roots up. On a crisp November morning, Sujin stood in front of a mirror in a small apartment she now shared with Hana and Jung-hee. It wasn't much, one bedroom and a living room that doubled as 2 more bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom with perpetually dripping faucet. But it was theirs. Their names were on the lease. Their belongings filled the drawers and closets. Their lives were being lived here. She was getting ready for her first day at a real job, a typing position at a law firm that had agreed to hire her despite her still imperfect English. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair styled neatly, a touch of the lipstick from that first Salon gift bag. The woman in the mirror was neither the girl she'd been before the war, nor the broken thing she'd been in the comfort station. She was someone new, someone still being invented, someone with a future that was uncertain but no longer impossible. "You look beautiful,"
Hannah said from the doorway, dressed in her own work clothes. She'd gotten a job in a restaurant kitchen and was working her way up, learning, saving money toward her dream. "You look like someone who matters." "So do you," Sujin replied, and meant it. They all mattered now. They'd reclaimed that fundamental truth that the comfort stations had tried to destroy, that they were human beings with inherent worth, that they deserved dignity and respect and kindness, that their trauma didn't define them, even though it had marked them. The threshold they'd crossed that day at the Salon had led to other thresholds: the picnic, the move to their own apartment, the jobs, the friendships, the slow, painful, precious work of building new lives. There would be more thresholds ahead, more challenges, more moments of doubt and grief and triggering memories. The scars would never fully fade. But they'd also discovered something powerful. They weren't crossing those thresholds alone. They had each other. They had the community of women that had welcomed them. They had professionals who believed in them. They had second chances they never expected to receive. As Sujin walked out the door that morning, she paused and looked back at the apartment, at Hannah waving goodbye from the window, at this life they'd somehow managed to build from the ashes of their trauma. The sunrise painted everything golden, and for the first time in years, Sujin allowed herself to believe that golden might be a fitting color for her future. The threshold of tomorrow wasn't behind them anymore. They'd crossed it, step by trembling step, and now stood on the other side, looking forward instead of back, building instead of just surviving, living instead of merely existing.
They'd been through hell and emerged changed but not destroyed, wounded but not defeated, scarred but still capable of beauty and joy and hope. That was their victory. That was their revenge against those who'd tried to break them. They'd survived. And now they were doing something even more radical. They were thriving. The morning sun rose higher, and with it rose 17 futures, uncertain but possible, fragile but real, earned through courage none of them had known they possessed. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button and share it with others who appreciate meaningful, thought-provoking narratives. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our future stories. We have many more powerful tales to share with you, stories that illuminate different corners of human experience and history. These stories take countless hours of research, writing, and narration to bring to life, and your support makes it possible for us to continue creating this kind of in-depth, emotionally resonant content. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought of The Threshold of Tomorrow. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. Remember, history is filled with untold stories of courage and survival. Join us as we continue to explore them together. Until next time, thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of this community of story lovers.